guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I will be sharing my thoughts on Frostbite by Richelle Mead. So Frostbite is the second book in the Vampire Academy series, and I originally had read this series when I was, I think, in late high school, and for the longest time I thought that Frostbite was the one that I had stopped at. But it turns out, upon rereading this, that this is not the last one I stopped at. If anything, I think I may have stopped my reading of this series initially when I had finished the third book, because predominantly the ending of this was very different than what I remember, and so it is entirely likely that I forgot I had actually read 3 books in the series as opposed to what I originally thought, which was the first 2. So this is going to contain some spoilers because of the fact that this is the second book in this reread series. It is something that is going to have a lot to do with what happens in the first book, so if you have not read the first book of this series, I would highly suggest you do so, just because I will be talking about some things that happen in the first book when discussing the events in this one, because this is basically taking off right after the events of Vampire Academy, the first book. So with that out of the way, let's go into what exactly Frostbite is. So, like I said, this takes place, I would say, probably within a few weeks after the first book, Vampire Academy, and Rose has basically been dealing with this indescribable lust and basically heartbreak and angst about the idea that she is in love with her guardian trainer, who is named Dimitri. Dimitri is a 24-year-old vampire guardian, basically. He is much older than Rose, who is 17 in this book, and she, in the last book, basically had this lust spell put upon her by this man named Victor Dashkoff, who was a family friend of her best friend Lissa, and they trusted him, but he was working essentially as not a double agent of sorts, but he was essentially trying to bring down Lissa in the sense that he wanted to use her powers to make him better, because he was slowly dying of sickness, and Lissa has this ability where she's able to heal people. It is not a power that is well known within the vampire community. If anything, it is incredibly rare for this to happen, because it involves basically controlling what is the spirit element, and it is very rare for Morai or the vampire community to have that ability. Now, where this all ties in with the lust spell is that in order to basically distract Rose from protecting Lissa, he placed a spell in this necklace that she had that basically caused Rose and Dimitri to nearly have sex for the first time together. And before this, they had had this kind of very tumultuous relationship where Dimitri was very much the overbearing, overprotective, very stoic character, and Rose has always been this very kind of off the beaten path kind of girl. She's definitely that, really stereotypical trope of not like other girls. She's sassy, she will fight back, she's not afraid to get her hands dirty if it means proving her own point, basically. So when this whole lust spell kicks in, it brings on this whole barrage of emotions that Rose had been basically denying she had for Dimitri, because she did find him attractive, but was more concerned of the fact that he was her teacher, he was her guardian in a sense, trainer, and essentially, she knew going into the relationship with him it wasn't going to work out. But when this lust spell had kicked in, it basically caused her to feel this overwhelming urge of lust, because not only did she realize that Dimitri may have feelings for her as well, but she actually felt like she was comfortable with him, and she kind of came to her own realization how much she deeply cared for Dimitri. Now, going into Frostbite, Dimitri has made it very clear that he does not want this relationship to work, because whether or not he does have feelings for Rose essentially doesn't matter. First and foremost, their job is to protect Lissa, and basically getting in a relationship would cause that distraction to be the forefront of their minds as opposed to what their actual job is. And that puts Rose in a really bad spot, because she is pining after Dimitri, but she also has this friend of hers that she's known and flirted with for a long time named Mason, who is very much smitten with her and is a really good guy, and Rose knows that he would be a good boyfriend, if not partner, later in life, but she is kind of battling with the feelings that she's developing for Mason with the one she has for Dimitri. Along with that, at the very beginning of this book, when Rose goes off to basically conduct this interview that essentially is going to help with her graduating, she finds out the person that was supposed to do this interview, he and his entire family have been killed by Strigoi, which are the evil vampires within this world. They are vampires that basically had killed either humans or other Morai and turn into these like demonic entities in a sense. And this place is actually very close to the campus that Rose attends school at, and so essentially the entire student body ends up being taken to a ski lodge for their Christmas break to protect them and make sure that they are safe over this time, because with the Strigoi being so close, they're worried that there could be a breach in security. With that, Rose now also has her mother coming into the picture, who we don't really see at all in Vampire Academy. We hear bits and pieces of how their relationship is not the greatest, how Rose does not really care for her mother, and her mother has been very absent in most of her life. And in this book, we actually start to see the real relationship between the two of them, with Rose's mother being this very strong, independent woman who did essentially abandon Rose and is not really regretful of that in any way, but she's also trying to be this motherly figure now when she actually is able to be in the same building as her, and that causes some really messy mother-daughter relationship dynamics within this. With all of this happening, essentially there is this rift coming in within the entire community of the Morai and the Dhampirs, or the half Morai, half human people, where essentially they're starting to think that if the Strigoi are really starting to come after them, why don't the Morai actually take a stand and use the powers that they are building to fight with the Dhampirs? There's this big kerfuffle happening where you start to see the politics of this world come in a little bit, where the Morai are kind of split between actually wanting to help the Dhampirs and go after the Strigoi, and then a large number of them being too afraid to, because they've lived this life where they do not fight. They let the Dhampirs go off and fight for them. But unfortunately, the Dhampirs are a smaller community when it comes to the amount of people that are able to protect the Morai, and so it is very hard to see for a lot of people why they can't fight with them. Because there's not a lot of them as it is, so why not just actually fight with them side by side? So there's this huge debate that goes on over the course of this, which leads to several people starting to think that maybe they should just up and leave and go start killing the Strigoi that are supposedly super close by, and essentially protect themselves before the Strigoi come and attack them. There's a lot of things going on within this, and on top of that, we have Lissa, who essentially in the first book had been suffering from massive depressive episodes because of her ability to use her magic, which was really taking a toll on her mental health. And in this, she ends up being able to start taking medicine to essentially combat that, but it keeps her from being able to actually use her powers. And so there's a bit of an internal struggle within Lissa that you start to see kind of come to the surface a little bit more so towards the end, where there's questioning of whether or not she should stay on this medication, whether she should stop taking it to start being able to use her powers more at the detriment of her own mental health. And within that as well, Lissa's spending a lot more time with her new boyfriend, Christian, which is causing a bit of a rift with Rose and Lissa, because Rose obviously is not seeing her best friend anymore, and a lot of things that Rose has been dealing with that she wants to talk with Lissa about, but she can't because Lissa is very busy all the time with her boyfriend and or dealing with the royalty things that Lissa has to deal with since she is a royal Morai. And then on top of all of that, we bring in a new character named Adrian, who is another Morai, and essentially is, I think, a cousin of Lissa, something like that, or they at least call each other cousin, kind of like how back in Greek and Roman times you would call everyone basically your brother or your cousin, because it's a big familial like friendship thing in a sense. And so Adrian proves another kind of possible love interest, not 100%. He's very charming, he's very, affluent, and he immediately sticks tight to Rose because he's very curious about her. He asks a lot of questions about the bond that Lissa and Rose have, which is very much apparent in the first book and is not really as prevalent in this one, but does come up every now and then because it has already been really discussed in great detail within the first book that it really wasn't a big deal in this one. So there are a ton of things that are brought up in this one that I really enjoyed. They all kind of seem to work well together in terms of furthering plots and furthering ideas of plots that were coming up. I honestly don't know any real flaws I had with this, maybe other than some of the angstiness. But in all honesty, the angstiness is what I really loved about this. I love anything to do with angsty love, will they, won't they kind of thing. That's always been something I've really loved, especially when it comes to YA. And specifically, it was one of the reasons I really loved Vampire Academy so much when I had first read it in high school, was this relationship dynamic between Rose and Dimitri, with this whole, they're not supposed to be together, but they really, really seem to want to. Rose is very much pining after somebody, and there's actually something that happens in here that is very reminiscent of something I actually had gone through myself when I was in high school, which I think is why I related a lot to Rose with the idea of pining after somebody. There's a very particular scene that really kind of grabbed my heartstrings in terms of this angst and this really pining moment for Rose, because it was very much something I actually had gone through myself at one point in my life with an ex-boyfriend I had, where essentially the guy that I was pining after was a guy I had dated very briefly, and he broke it off, but I was very much in love with him. It was very much one of the first relationships I had had where I definitely had more feelings in the relationship than the other person did, and he had broke it off, and then a few months later I find out that he was been pining after somebody else that was also unavailable. And so essentially it was this whole thing where I was like, but what about me? Why am I not the one that, you know, you're pining after? I've been here for you this whole time, you know, all these things. So there's kind of this thing with Rose where she kind of goes through that in a lot of ways, because there's another woman that comes into the picture that is very, very much interested in Dimitri. It is very obvious, and Rose is able to see it and also sees that Dimitri has some kind of feelings for her, whether or not they're as romantic as what she feels for Dimitri. But essentially it causes Rose to go into this very angsty, very teenager-y, pissed off kind of thing, which I think is very relatable for a lot of people, especially like myself, who have gone through those very similar situations. And so I really related to Rose in a lot of ways with that, and it honestly broke my heart because I was on the other end of that myself, so I know exactly how that feels. I honestly had no issues with this at all. It flew by super quick, just like Vampire Academy did. Like, I sat and read the last 140 pages basically within 2 days, and that was because I read the first 70 pages late at night, went to bed, picked it up literally the day I am filming this, earlier today, and just flew through the last 70 pages of this within an hour, and it was very fun. I really loved the action scenes. There's not a lot of them that go through this because obviously the main climax of the book is where the action scenes happen, so we don't see them until toward the end, which is fine. That's what I really like about this, is that we get a lot of setup and understanding of Rose and the relationships she has and how they develop or how they falter, and then we also have this overarching plot of action and death and destruction basically happening in the background, and then it comes up at the end kind of thing. I will say, like I said, the ending of this surprised me, mostly because I thought that the ending of this was going one particular way, and it turns out that the ending I'm thinking of happens in, I believe, book 3. So that makes me kind of happy, because I thought that I was only 2 books in, and it turns out I was at least 3 books into this series before I had to put it down. By the end of this, we got some very beautiful scenes with Rose and Dimitri that make me very excited for what's happening later, because it seems like there's going to be some great things happening between the two of them. There was a very heartbreaking scene also involving the death of one particular character that I really, really loved. He was one of my favorites going into this series, and it honestly made me start crying, because I didn't remember that he died at all. I did not remember that he was killed in this book, and so when it came up, it was a huge shock, which is what I love a lot about rereading some of these series that I have very vague memories of, because it makes me feel like I'm reading it for the first time. That's all I can really say without spoiling a whole heck of a lot. I will be going into a little bit more in detail of some things that happen in this when I go to do my next review for the next book in this series, for Shadow Kiss. So if you've read Frostbite yourself and have some thoughts on it in terms of the plot, some of the things that came up, or anything at all regarding it or the Vampire Academy series in general, feel free to leave some comments down below. Try to keep it non-spoilery for people that are coming to this video and are wanting to have a non-spoilery review for what happens in this, because like I had just gone through, I talked a lot about what happened in Vampire Academy to lead into this, and so for people that read Vampire Academy but haven't haven't read this, I'd like to keep things about Frostbite a little less spoilery, just so that people who are reading this one can have a little bit more of an open mind going into it and not be spoiled for things that happen, especially toward the end of this, because there are some things, like I said, that kind of came out of left field for me that I didn't remember. So I want to extend that same courtesy to people who are reading this for the first time and don't know what they're getting into, kind of thing. And that's kind of how I'm going to be doing the reviews for this in the future, is that basically we'll do some background on the other books in this series for people who need a bit of a recap, and then going into the book I'm actually reviewing with less spoilers, because I'm assuming people who are watching these videos are going to be in the middle of or starting or wanting to at least read this particular book that I'm reviewing, and I want it to be enjoyable and not cause people to get upset by the spoilery content within this. With that being said though, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!